Hi class, welcome to lesson 2. Today we will complete exercise 5F, solving equations using the null factor law. To start with, what does 4 times 0 equal? 0. 0 times 5? 0. What about y times 0? Yep, that also equals 0. And 0 times x? 0. So anything that's multiplied by 0 gives us the answer 0. So if we have A times B equals 0, what do we know about the values of A and B? Well, if A times B equals 0, we know that either A or B must be 0. This gives us the null factor law, which states that if A times B equals 0, then either A equals 0 or B equals 0. To solve a quadratic equation, we follow these steps. First, we rearrange the equation so the right-hand side equals 0. Next, we factorise using either common factors, difference of perfect squares, or quadratics, where we find two numbers that multiply to the end number and add to the middle, then we put them in the two brackets. Next, we use the null factor law, which means we make each factor equal 0, and the last step, we solve for x using inverse operations. Let's look at this example. The first step has already been done. The right-hand side equals 0. The next step is to factorise. This is already factorised. So now I need to apply the null factor law, which states that either this or this is 0 because the equation equals 0. So I write this out. X plus 5 equals 0 or x plus 4 equals 0. Then my last step is to solve for x. So I use my inverse operations. I'm going to subtract 5 over to this side, which will give me x equals 0 minus 5, negative 5, or I'm going to subtract 4. So x equals negative 4. So these are my two solutions here. I'll show you another example. So here's our equation here. The first two steps have already been done. The right-hand side equals 0, and it's already factorised. So I need to apply the null factor law, which states that either x plus 8 equals 0 or x minus the square root of 5 equals 0. Then I solve for x using inverse operations. So I'm going to subtract 8 over to this side. X equals negative 8. Or I'm going to do the inverse operation. So the opposite of subtracting square root 5 is adding square root 5. So x equals square root 5. So these are my two solutions. Let's solve this example from the textbook. The first step has been done. The right-hand side equals 0. The next step is to factorise. The method we will use is finding a common factor. So a common factor of both of these terms, well, x goes into both of them. So I bring that out the front, open up the brackets, and I think x needs to be multiplied by what to give x squared? X times x. And x needs to be multiplied by negative 2 to give negative 2x equals 0. Then I need to apply the null factor law. I'll just write that on the side, null factor law. So I know that either this factor equals 0, so x equals 0, or this factor, x minus 2 equals 0. Then my last step, I solve for x. Well, this one here, this has already been solved, so we can just write x equals 0, already solved. Or this one here, we need to bring the 2 to the other side, so plus it to the other side, x equals 2. Next example, the right hand side is already 0, so next step is to factorize. This one here, we're going to factorize using the difference of perfect squares method. So that will give us x plus 3, x minus 3. Remember, we square root each part, equals 0. And then I apply the null factor law, which states that either x plus 3 equals 0 or x minus 3 equals 0. Then the last step is I solve for x using my inverse operations. So x equals minus 3 or x equals plus 3. Next example, I'm up to the factorizing step. So this is a quadratic. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give 6 but add to give -5. I'll let you guys think about that. Two numbers that multiply to give 6 but add to give -5. This is, so you should have the answers -2 and -3. So that equals 6 when I multiply them because the negatives cancel out. But if I add them, they'll give me -5. So I put them in the brackets. I've got x minus 2, x minus 3 equals 0. Then I apply the null factor law. So either x minus 2 equals 0 or x minus 3 equals 0. Last step, solve using inverse operations. So add the 2 to this side, x equals 2, or we're going to plus the 3 to this side, x equals 3. So there are my two solutions. Second last example. So I'm up to the factorizing step. This is also a quadratic. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give 1 but add to give 2. There's only one thing that multiplies to 1, 1 times 1, and 1 plus 1. Alright, so that forms my brackets, x plus 1, x plus 1 equals 0. Then I apply the null factor law, so x plus 1 equals 0 or x plus 1 equals 0. Hang on, they're the same. So just need the first one. And then I'm going to solve. So I'm going to subtract 1, x equals -1. So because they're both the same, we just have the one solution this time. Last example. So for this one here, we need to do the first step, which is rearrange the equation so the right-hand side equals 0. So to do that, I'm basically going to subtract both of these onto the other side. So I'll have x squared minus 4x minus 60, and I'm left with nothing on the other side, 0. So I've done the first step, which is to rearrange it. Now I can factorize, and this is a quadratic. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give negative 60, but add to give negative 4. All right, so if we've got negative 10 times 6, that equals negative 60, and negative 10 plus 6, that equals negative 4. If you're not sure, just put it into the CAS calculator, menu algebra factor, and it'll tell you. So then we put it in our brackets. We've got x minus 10, x plus 6 equals 0. Then apply the null factor law, which states that either x minus 10 equals 0 or x plus 6 equals 0. Solve for x, plus this over to this side, which means x equals 10. And then I'm going to subtract this over to the other side, x equals negative 6. And there are my two solutions. So the only additional thing with this one was I rearrange the equation so the right hand side equals 0. So basically just move the things to the other side using the inverse operations. Our CAS calculators can factorize and solve the equation for us. I go to the calculator. I press the menu button, algebra, solve. I type in my equation, x squared minus 49 equals 0. Then I press comma. So this is the comma here. And then I type in the letter x and press enter. And here it's solved for me. So the steps are menu, algebra, solve, type in your equation, then type a comma, x, then press enter. These are the textbook questions I would like you to do from exercise 5F. A few building understanding, which they're at the start of the exercise, and then if you scroll down you'll reach the main exercise where I want you to do those set questions. I've highlighted in red ones that are a bit more difficult, and I'm kind of okay if you skip them.